Hello chaps, welcome to John Robson Guitar Tuition. Another one of these videos about what I've learned from a certain player. Today we're going to be talking about what I've learned from Joe Satriani, and hopefully you can learn something too. Now then, before we get into all of the twiddly lead stuff, which is probably the reason why you clicked on this video, you do need to have a little bit of an understanding of what he does with his chord sequences. And one trick that he tends to use a lot of the time is to use modal chord sequences. I've done other videos at some length on the whole subject of modes, so if you want to go and search those out, perhaps I'll put a link below to one of the more comprehensive ones that I've done. I'm not going to go into modes in great depth here. I'll just give you a brief explanation of what I'm talking about. Okay, if we take an A chord, for example, okay, obviously that A chord occurs in the key of A, but it also occurs in other keys. For instance, if you were to do the old wild thing trick of, you know, the kind of E chord to A, B, and then back to the E chord again, then you're quite obviously in the key of E, and we have an A chord there. So why don't we take that A chord and make that the focus of our wild thing chord sequence? And the way that Joe Satriani will do this is to just keep the bass note constant. So if I slim that A chord down to just this, still a full A chord, and keep the open A bass string going on underneath, I get that sounds perfectly fine. Now, what are the other chords in that wild thing sequence? Well, we've got a B chord, so let's keep the A bass note the same and move the chord up from A to B. And then how about if we then go to the other chord in our wild thing example, which is an E chord, like that, but I'm just going to play this part of it with the open A bass string underneath. That's almost jazz, that, isn't it? So if we string those together, we'll get A to the B, E, like that. So we have an A to a B to an E to an A, but all of those chords are kind of hanging, if you like, off a bass note, a constant A bass line. And when you do that, in that sense, you know, when you kind of starting from the 4 chord, you know, if we go back to our wild thing kind of example, 1 chord, 4 chord, 5 chord, when basically you make the 4 chord, which in this case is A, into the focus of proceedings in one way or another, here we're doing it via a bass note, you are said to be in the Lydian mode. And the Lydian mode is one of Satriani's favourite modes. He tends to use it a lot. Flying in a Blue Dream is a brilliant example of the Lydian mode. Another thing that he will tend to do is kind of take a leaf out of the jazz playbook, really. In 1959, Miles Davis turned the jazz world on its head by starting to play modal stuff, like we've just described there. Basically what he did on a track like So What was he would take a riff like that and play that for, I think it's 16 bars, and then simply move it up a semitone. Play that for 8 bars or so, and then back down into that. So the idea is that you're moving from one particular tonality. In this case we're using A. In Miles Davis's case he used D minor, and then just shifting to a completely unrelated, unconnected chord centre. And Satriani does that a hell of a lot. For instance, we could take this A sequence, this A Lydian mode sequence of the A chord, then the B chord over the A bass, then the E chord over the A bass, and then back to the A chord over the A bass. And let's move that somewhere else. Let's transpose that all up into C. So you'd have a C chord, then you'd have a D chord over a C bass, then you'd have a G chord over a C bass, then you'd be back to the C chord again. And you stay on that for as long as you want, and then go back to the original A Lydian sequence like that. Here's a little clip of me recording a backing track. You'll see in the top part of the screen the bass part that I'm playing, where I'm just kind of staying constantly on, first of all, an A note, then a C note, then back to an A note. And in the bottom half of the screen you'll see what chords I'm kind of playing off the top of that of those bass notes. Here's the clip, and hopefully it'll kind of make sense. Okay, so that's the chord sequence sorted out. Hopefully that all made sense. So what are we going to do in terms of lead guitar over the top? Well, the one thing that you really do have to know before we go any further is your pentatonic scales. Satriani doesn't really use pentatonics as the sort of basis of his soloing in the way that I play, like Eric Clapton would, for example, but they are the bedrock upon which we're going to be working. If we just, for instance, concentrate on the A chord section of that backing track, the A Lydian mode, where, as I said, we're going from an A chord to a B chord over an A bass, to an E chord over an A bass, then back to an A chord over the A bass. If we take a look at that, then it very much feels centered, as it's meant to, around the A chord, A major. So we're going to be basing a lot of what we're doing here on the A major pentatonic. And if we're in this sort of nice comfortable area of the neck up here in sort of the middle of the fretboard, then the obvious shape for A major pentatonic is position number 4. Again, if you're not sure about the location of pentatonic scales and how to figure out where your major pentatonic is as opposed to your minor pentatonic, then you need to go away and do some work on that. Conveniently, I have a video which explains it all, and I'll put that link in the description box below as well. But let's assume that you are okay with the pentatonic scale. Here it is again. Basic pentatonic box shape number 4. Okay, we can use that as the basis for a lot of the soloing, but we need to get this more modal kind of feel going on as well. And the way we do that is by looking at what's going on in the chords. Now, all of the notes in an A chord, the A note, the C sharp note and the E note, are all found in that A major pentatonic scale. But if we go up to the B chord, we have something else happening there. We have, in a B chord, we have a B note. That's in the A major pentatonic. We have an F sharp note, which is also in the A major pentatonic. But we have a D sharp note. There it is there, which isn't in the A major pentatonic. So the first thing you do is you start looking for D sharp notes in the same vicinity of the neck as the A major pentatonic that you're playing. So here's the A major pentatonic again, and we finish here on this E note at the 12th fret. Well, D sharp is always one fret below E, isn't it? So if you know where the other E notes are in the scale, well, there's one there. D sharp will be there as well, and there's an E note there. D sharp is one fret below that. Got a little bit ahead of myself there by adding another note in. So that's how you would add in the D sharp notes to your A major pentatonic. Going to the other chord in the chord sequence, the E chord, this has a G sharp note in it, which isn't in the A major pentatonic, so we'd better add that in as well. And we can see there it is there, second string, 9th fret. So just looking at that A major pentatonic pattern again, there it is there. We've added in the D sharp note. Coming down, there's the G sharp. There, so then just adding in the G sharp note wherever else it occurs. There's our D sharp note from earlier. And there's the other G sharp. So now we have a sequence of notes, a scale that goes. That is a fingering for the A Lydian mode, and that's the way you do this kind of thing. You look for notes in the chords which aren't there in your kind of basis pentatonic, and from that little phrase, from that little scale there, we can start doing all kinds of Satriani-esque things. If you saw the video I did a week or so ago about my 5 favourite licks and what they are called, you may have come across a lick called the hippopotamus. I call it that because it's rhythmically, it sort of says hippopotamus. If I start on this G sharp note here, for example, and go up the notes of the A Lydian mode, just using hammer-ons, and then come down using pull-offs, and join that together, that's kind of going hippopotamus, hippopotamus, and just give myself a bit more gain. We can loop that round. Using the hammer-ons and pull-offs, you know, as described. Shift it onto other strings, that kind of thing. Slide it around. This is where knowing where the notes are on the neck and just knowing your scale patterns becomes invaluable, really, because you can do all kinds of stuff. Like that. That's just sort of sliding and slithering around the neck using the legato technique that again is another big part of Joe Satriani's playing, but it's, as much as having a solid hammer-on, pull-off and sliding technique, it's kind of being familiar with where your fingers have got to go to, so you don't have that microsecond of blind panic and doubt about where you're going to go, which is what will trip you up. Anyway, let's have a look now at me using those techniques and some pentatonic-y type stuff as well in a solo that I played over the top of the backing track that you've heard. So there you have it. That wasn't me trying to do a Joe Satriani impersonation. That was just me playing like me, really, but using the techniques that I've learned from Joe Satriani's playing. One thing I should have mentioned before I did that solo was that when it goes up to the C Lydian section, all I do really is just move all of the ideas that I described earlier from A Lydian up to C Lydian, just transpose everything up 3 frets, and that's going to take care of that. I will just say at this stage here that if the idea of learning scale patterns and modal names and all that sort of complicated theory stuff intimidates you, then please don't be intimidated by it. There is a wealth of resources out there on the internet, and at the risk of sounding like the 4 Yorkshiremen in the Monty Python sketch, when I were a lad, we didn't have the internet. What we had were public libraries, and this is kind of where I learned a lot of this stuff from. I lived in quite a rural area in the mid to late 80s, which is when I was kind of piecing all this stuff together for myself. And the local library didn't really have a great sort of music theory section, but what it did do for you was it would order books for you. So, you would kind of read about a certain book that Joe Satriani, for example, had found useful. He would maybe mention it in a guitar magazine interview or something. So you just go to the library and see if they could get it for you. And it is so much easier now when all you've got to do is just Google something. So there's really no excuse if you desperately want to get to know this sort of stuff. It's all there for you. One thing that you will have to do, as you've probably gathered, is get the little finger working for a living. Before I started getting into all of this, as I say, it was kind of around about 86, 87 sort of time. I was the typical 3-fingered blues rock guitarist, and I still revert to that kind of way of playing if I'm doing something a bit Clapton-y or something like that. Like that. I never use the little finger other than for kind of just grabbing that extra note on a string bend or something. But a little bit of re-education of the fingers, and it soon gets used to doing what it's supposed to. The other thing, of course, is that you don't have to have an encyclopedic knowledge of all of this stuff before you start using it. As you saw earlier, I was doing a lot of this kind of stuff within the bounds of one scale pattern. So learn it in one part of the neck, get familiar with it, make that your little goal, your little project to say this time next month I'm going to be able to solo in this particular scale pattern. And then gradually you will build it up and you'll be able to connect it all together. It is, I guarantee, a lot more accessible than you think it probably is. And on that note, I will say farewell for now. I will just mention, as usual, that if you want some tailored one-to-one guitar tuition in this style or any other, whatever your level of playing, beginner to advanced, then get in touch with me via the details at the end of this video. I do lessons face-to-face if you live on Teesside in the northeast of England, and wherever you are in the world you can have lessons with me via Skype, and either way your first lesson is free. I'll also just take this opportunity to plug the 2 albums that I have out at the moment. The one that was released earlier this year is called The Whiskey Made Me Do It, because it did, and the one that's just come out recently is called Handles for Forks, and they're both full of bluesy, shreddy, melodic instrumental guitar. So if you're a fan of Satriani, then you're probably going to enjoy these albums that I've got out. They're available on all the usual platforms, Amazon, iTunes, Google Play, whatever. There's a link in the description box below to where you can get them, and yeah, check them out, you will enjoy them. And with that, I shall leave you for now, folks. Hope you've enjoyed it, hope you found it useful. If you have, hit the subscribe button, and until next time, bye for now.